From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
All right, welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington as we await remarks from President Biden, who is set to speak any minute now at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum in New York. These are remarks, Joe, that will be specifically focused on climate and the green transition, clean energy goals, we understand. And, of course, it follows his earlier speech at the United Nations General Assembly, the last one of its kind that he will give as president.
Yeah, how about that? The 79th session of the UN General Assembly, which has snarled traffic in New York, but is a major moment for this president, winding things down, considering his legacy and trying to project forward here a bit. When it comes to climate policy, we're told this is being billed as a bit of a progress report that we'll hear from Joe Biden. Of course, we'll bring those remarks to you live right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Yeah, the White House has indicated in advance of these remarks that while he's going to be talking about climate and conservationism, he also is going to talk about how each of those goals also bring along progress in lower energy costs, jobs, and a healthier planet, obviously. So perhaps tying it back to the economy and the domestic impact
economy
too.
This week. Yeah, as we hear from both presidential candidates, Kaylee, on the early edition, we brought you remarks from Donald Trump outlining his economic policy proposals in a speech today in Savannah, Georgia. Tomorrow, it's going to be Kamala Harris's turn. She's going to Pittsburgh as these two campaigns try to contrast their economic policy proposals, knowing they have some overlap on things like no taxes on tips. We'll see how different things sound tomorrow.
Yeah, indeed we will. And of course, we're also expecting to hear more from Donald Trump himself tomorrow in North Carolina, where he will be speaking. So clearly, there's a lot in focus as we come to air this evening here in Washington, both on the campaign trail and, of course, what we're about to hear in New York from the incumbent president, who is no longer running in this race.
So let's get into it. We're joined right now by Bloomberg's Iain Marlow and Michelle Jamrisko as we get things started on the Tuesday edition, the late edition of Balance of Power. Michelle, we'll start with you. It's great to see you as we consider the impact politically of Joe Biden's remarks earlier at the UN and what we're going to hear now. Geopolitics, you can't hide from, obviously, in this room of world leaders in New York, but it ties into particularly the story about China, which is your specialty, the global south, and the impact that it has had on climate, which is a very difficult sticking point for this administration.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see across the board from last weekend with the Quad Summit through to today and tomorrow and with UNGA, Biden just trying to kind of tie up all the loose ends of his legacy and really hitting home all the themes that he's tried to promote throughout this presidency. China being, of course, one of them. We saw that with the Quad last weekend. It was kind of the looming issue always in the background. You heard a lot of the tagline, the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Yes.
What I thought was interesting today, though, in his speech and his address to the UNGA was that he made these remarks about bilateral cooperation with China. The camera flashes to the Chinese envoy, kind of looking stone-faced on. And then a couple seconds later, he launches into some lines, not naming China, but discussing the military threat in the South China Sea and other ways that the U.S. is trying to make sure that there is a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is always a veiled counter to China. So you see that throughout the joint declaration out of the Quad last weekend. Nearly every issue cited: cyber, maritime security, definitely infrastructure, health, all are kind of positioned to counter China. So you still see that as a looming theme, even when it's not named directly.
Well, and certainly we saw that in the speech, Michelle, as you mentioned. So let's hear a little bit of what President Biden said at the UN General Assembly today, specifically about his legacy.
I decided after 50 years of public service, it's time for a new generation of leadership to take my nation forward. My fellow leaders, let us never forget, some things are more important than staying in power. It's your people.
And in New York is Iain Marlow, who we'll bring into this conversation now. So, Iain, obviously, this is likely a sentimental moment for Biden as he tries to cement his foreign policy legacy, and the last time he'll get to speak at a forum like this as president. But he had some pretty clear messaging, not just about his legacy, but also about the importance of alliances, for example, when addressing conflicts that may go on well after his term in office is over.
Yeah, exactly. I think he was pretty clear tonight. He was trying to talk about optimism, trying to offer a sense of perspective, because some of the conflicts that he's dealt with during his presidency, whether it's Ukraine, which has dragged on for years, Sudan, which doesn't look like it's getting any better, and the Gaza and the Mideast war with Gaza, and now Lebanon, which is escalating as world leaders gather here in New York. There's a lot of pessimism about not just those conflicts, but about the Biden administration's ability to handle them and to bring about permanent peace. And so he was trying to sort of offer a sort of broader scope of history, going back to the Vietnam War, quoting Mandela, trying to say that these things look incredibly challenging until suddenly you have a solution. And if you've been paying attention to the Biden administration's messaging about Gaza in particular, they've often hinted that we're, very close to some kind of deal, even as things on the ground seem to be moving further and further from that sort of direction. So I think there's obviously a legacy piece here. He wants to secure a broader Mideast peace deal. He was talking about a Palestinian state, and there's not much time left. And optimism is not. Especially here this week with the war in Lebanon, sort of escalating. There's a lot of pessimism about the chances for that kind of deal that he thinks could secure his legacy here.
Pessimism about chances, Michelle, and concern about the looming election here in the United States. What are you hearing about UNGA and a Trump 2.0?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of the same story that we've seen for the past year, even since Biden was in the race. There is a great deal among allies. There's a great deal of skepticism that there will be the same commitment on things, of course, like the war in Ukraine, as we've seen how Trump has said he would handle it and he would promise to end the war. It never would have started under his reign. So very different policies. But I think across the board on foreign policy, I mean, what we're seeing, we have different challenges in reporting on Trump and Harris. The challenge with Trump is that he'll give details often, as with Chinese tariffs or tariffs on any other country. He likes to throw out the numbers. He said, the 200% tariffs on John Deere if they move manufacturing to Mexico was one of the latest. He's talked about 60% tariffs on China, 100% on countries that de-dollarize. Right. But he's not wedded to those numbers. As we've seen, he loves unpredictability more than anything. So we can't, hinge everything on those numbers. And then with Harris, we have the opposite problem, where we don't have those details at all. And we're hearing from her, kind of more of the Biden-Harris rhetoric, but not really how she might be different from her boss currently. So we'll see, in the weeks to come, how that might be received. But I think, as far as the reception from allies and other partners and either other countries abroad, it's still a whole lot of, unpredictability, uncertainty.
Well, and as we consider where the uncertainty is, we remember, Iain, that Donald Trump, for example, wouldn't even answer whether or not he wants Ukraine to win the war in the presidential debate with Harris earlier this month. So I wonder how that changes the characterization of the meetings that President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine will have with Biden and Harris at the White House. We're expecting later this week for him to push a plan to end the war with Russia. I wonder to what extent that's trying to get ahead of potentially how Donald Trump would like to end the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've definitely seen from the NATO summit that Biden held here, held in Washington over the summer, when everyone was sort of watching whether he would drop out of the race. That was one of the main parts of that summit and that initiative. With the Biden administration is trying to make sure that some of the things they've done on Ukraine, some of the funding commitments, some of the institutional commitments to eventual NATO membership or EU membership, that those last beyond the term and beyond Biden's term. And that was, it's with only a couple of months left is becoming a much more real issue for Biden when he deals with some of these foreign leaders. Some of them, like Netanyahu, when he was last here in the summer, met with Trump. People are hedging their bets. Foreign ministers from big European countries are meeting with Trump and his delegation. A lot of the ambassadors in Washington are also reaching out to the Trump camp and making sure that they have an understanding of their idea, who's advising him, who's likely to take a position in his administration. So there's a lot of, he's he's the front, he's the challenger for the Republicans, but he also looms very large in these other conversations because he, especially on some of these big foreign policy issues, has said he will take a different tact. And as Michelle said as well, his unpredictability is another huge factor on some of these issues, because whether it's Gaza, whether it's Ukraine, we know the administration's view, and they've stuck to it sort of doggedly. In Ukraine, almost 3 years, and Gaza, almost 1 year now. Trump would approach things differently, and I think everyone knows that. And so that's sort of one of the looming things that's looming over the meetings here in New York.
We're going to be hearing from President Biden again momentarily from the Bloomberg Global Business Forum as part of his travels in New York. And again, Michelle, this is going to be tied to climate. And I wonder what you're expecting to hear. How much of this will be backward-looking as we talk legacy, or forward-looking for the challenges that'll face the next president?
Well, I can't get into too much detail. We'll have to see if he rolls out anything new. But I think it'll be a balance of those two things. It'll
be progress report, as the White House termed it.
Progress report, celebrating the legacy, but also in the same sense as we've been talking about, as Iain just mentioned, sort of Trump-proofing some of this stuff, trying to figure out how to get allies on board with things that would have a deadline or an expiration date that runs past the next administration, or at least past the next election, should Trump come to power, because this is an issue that we know he is kind of polar opposite than the current administration. Yeah. So is probably not going to like anything that the president says in the moments to come.
Well, it's also worth pointing out that some of what Biden heralds as his greatest climate achievements, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the many components of it, some of that is at risk of potentially at least being attempted a rollback, depending on the balance of Congress ultimately in this election. So not all of the changes he's been able to bring about under his administration are necessarily inherently permanent. And it'll be interesting to see how he phrases that as he's getting ready to speak now at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum in New York. He is just now walking up to the podium. We'll be bringing you his remarks live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Let's listen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If I were smart, I'd leave now. Thank you all so very much. Mr. Mayor, Michael, thank you. I awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom because you've literally revolutionized our economy. It's not hyperbole. You transformed how we consume information. You challenged and solved the toughest issues. And thank you for hosting this important forum. And thank all the business leaders here today. And thank my cabinet members for their work as well. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm is here. The EPA Administrator Michael Reagan is here. 4 years ago, Kamala and I inherited the worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. I got to hold a minute here and tell you a little story. When I sat in the Oval Office every morning at 9 o'clock and then ended the day with Barack for 8 years, and there was only one portrait above the fireplace, a portrait of George Washington, fairly small but a beautiful portrait. And so I didn't realize at the time, all the times I've been in the Oval, that the incoming president cannot go into the Oval on the 20th until after 4 o'clock, and the outgoing president has to leave by 10, although the outgoing president never showed up. Anyway, so I asked my brother Jim, who has a better taste than I do, to pick what we needed to pick what desk you want, what rug, the things you want in your office. And I said I only wanted a couple things. I wanted to make sure I had the Resolute desk, and I wanted, looking next to the fireplace, I wanted the bust of Martin Luther King, who was one of my heroes as I was coming up as a young civil rights guy, and Bobby Kennedy. I have great admiration for John Kennedy, but I could never picture him at my kitchen table. Anyway, so we're standing, I walk in, and my brother's showing me, and I look up, and there's this giant portrait of Franklin Roosevelt. And John Meacham was on the speaker. And I said, why Franklin Roosevelt? I admire him, but why Franklin Roosevelt? He said, well, No one's inherited an economy more disarray than when Franklin Roosevelt was president. I said, isn't that wonderful? Swear to God, true story. Look to the left, there's Abraham Lincoln. I said, why Abraham Lincoln? I admired the hell out of Lincoln, but why? He said, the country has never been as divided since the Civil War. I said, I'm the hell out of here. Anyway. But look, a lot's changed. A lot's changed. When he came to office, the climate is in crisis, and one existential threat that faces all nations. Mayor Bloomberg, Michael, you've convened leadership, national and international levels, to lead the charge and change the mindset. You know, I just met with the president of the UAE, who is a massive investor in clean energy around the world. That's what he wanted to talk to me about. I just hosted a 3-day conference at the Quad in Delaware, with the Prime Minister of India, Australia, and Japan, 3 of the fastest growing economies in the world. They understand you can't remain dependent on fossil fuels. They need to lead the clean energy future. I had a discussion with the president of Kenya, whom I hosted in the for a state visit. Kenya is also a global leader in clean energy. Together we've launched the U.S.-Kenya Climate and Clean Energy and Industrial Partnership. All this matters. Now I want to pivot to home here. Since I've been president, I've flown over more wildfires, unfortunately, it's the God's truth, in helicopters, from Arizona, Idaho, all the way to Montana. And more acreage, I've looked down and I've seen more acreage burned on the ground, to the ground, than the entire state of Maryland in terms of the area. Just wildfires. I've toured the community, ravaged by tornadoes and floods. More that costs lives and livelihoods. It costs taxpayers billions of dollars in damage. But when Kamala and I came to office, there was no real plan in place to do anything about it. As the government, we were doing nothing, virtually nothing. We were determined not only to deliver immediate economic relief to the American people, but to transform how our economy works in the long term, to write a new economic playbook, to grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up instead of the top down. That way, workers do well, no one's left behind, and the wealthy still do very well. And foster fair competition. Invest in all of America and all Americans. And I've been pointing out, when it comes to the climate, every time I talk about it, whether I was trying to convince labor or business to come along, I'd say, when I think climate, I think jobs. I think jobs, and I mean it. Good union-paying jobs. In fact, I'm proud to have kept my commitment to bring unions and business to the climate table. That's what we're seeing. Rather than climate conservation about sacrifice, conversation about sacrifice, or focus on doing less, Kamala and I have pursued an ambitious climate policy focused on growth. And the public and private sector lead all of it. All of you in this audience, you've led, building our economic capacity. Together we've proven the strong middle class, thriving innovation and manufacturing are the key to winning climate here at home and abroad. Here are the key climate pages from the new economic playbook. We rejoined the Paris Agreement immediately after my predecessor had walked away. We got to work pulling private capital off the sidelines, getting the workers in the game, and once again leading the world on climate. Bringing jobs back home, manufacturing and technology. We invented here in the United States decades ago, bringing it back. We're bringing back hope and pride in communities, opening shuttered factories in zip codes too often left behind. I might point out I was criticized very much for having done more to invest in red states than blue states. But I made a commitment that when I ran, I'd be president for all people, whether they voted for me or not. And we're doing that in what I call Investing in America agenda. I wrote and signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, the most significant climate law ever passed in the history of the world. We were told it couldn't get done, but we did it. More than $369 billion in climate and clean energy. Not a single Republican voted for it, but the Inflation Reduction Act lowers energy costs for families with rebates and tax credits to install rooftop solar and energy-efficient appliances, weatherizing their windows and doors and high-tech insulation, and more efficient heating and cooling systems, and so much more. And you get a tax credit for doing it. The groundbreaking laws also catalyze clean energy innovation in areas like battery technology, nuclear energy, geothermal, that will create hundreds of thousands of jobs for American workers. In fact, along with other historic investments in infrastructure, and our infrastructure bill was $1.3 trillion in science and technology, private companies in the United States and globally have announced investments of nearly $1 trillion in clean energy manufacturing here in America in the last 3 years. And you all are the leaders of that. You're the ones. We're just getting started. In the face of the dangerous and deadly impacts of climate change, we're also making our cities and towns more resilient. This is a new formula on climate: creating jobs, reducing pollution, cleaning up our water and air, improving our quality of life, building a better America. For example, a once-in-a-generation modernization of our grid means this year we'll add more new electric capacity than we have in 2 decades, and 96% of that will be clean energy. I went to the University of Delaware, and a university professor was the first professor, the first solar-powered building that inspired residential solar adaptation. And more than 80% of the solar panels and components are manufactured in China, though. But now we're turning that around. American solar panel manufacturing is up 4 times what it was 4 years ago, with more to come. America invented the lithium-ion battery technology that's powering our clean energy transformation, including electric vehicles and the grid. But when Kamala and I came to office, America was barely making any of these batteries, while other countries are commercializing them, but not anymore. With more than 14 gigafactories, massive, large-scale factories opening or under construction to make advanced batteries here in America, and more to come. We're also making the battery components here in America, making sure the supply chain starts in America. And all of this is helping power an electric revolution in transportation. We've quadrupled the development of electric vehicles since it took office. We're deploying a fleet of clean school buses that will not pollute the air. Our postal service is going fully electric. We've invested $45 billion in electric trains in America, because if a person can choose between a car and a train to get to the destination at the same time, 70–80% of that, they will take the train. And it's 70–80% less pollution than driving the same distance. And we now have tools to lower emissions from building materials. For the first time ever, we're beginning to produce clean steel, cement, and aluminum. I think most Americans have no idea how much pollution has occurred when you make cement. Well, the American people know how much pollution heavy industries produce. Since each one produces as much pollution as a small country, we're now making most significant investment ever in rural America. 80,000 farms across America are implementing climate-smart agriculture, cover crops, nutrient management, storing carbon in the soil, which creates new sources of wealth for farmers, families, and at the same time. We're also carrying out the most ambitious conservation agenda in a long time. We're on track to conserve, a commitment I made, 30% of all our lands and waters by the year 2030. Since taking office, my administration has already conserved over 42 million acres. The Inflation Reduction Act is also the most significant law ever advanced in environmental justice for disadvantaged and so-called fence-line communities, like Cancer Alley in Louisiana or Route 9 corridor in Delaware. We're making sure these communities receive 40% of the benefits of the key investments in pollution reduction, clean energy, and infrastructure. All this matters. It matters a great deal. Just under 4 years, the economy has created nearly 16 million jobs, the most ever in a single presidential term. In just 2 years since the Inflation Reduction Act, we've created more than 330,000 clean energy jobs. I should say you've created that. Clean energy jobs are growing twice as fast as the economy overall. Clean energy workers are joining unions at the highest level in history. And I'm really proud to have launched the American Climate Corps, patterned after the Peace Corps and American Corps, to put tens of thousands of young people on the path to good-paying, clean energy jobs to improve our environment and grow our economy. And you know, the United States has reasserted America's position as a global leader in climate. We're leading an all-out effort to partner with nations to reduce global emissions, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You all remember when Putin invaded Ukraine, which sent food and energy prices soaring around the world, and showing just how volatile and fragile a fossil fuel-based economy can be. The United States rallied the world against Putin's aggression. We've led the world in releasing oil reserves and stabilizing global energy markets, while also working quickly as possible to deploy clean energy resources. You know, I convened summit leaders on climate and the American Leaders Summit, the African Leaders Summit, I should say. In COP28, the United States galvanized the world to commit, for the first time, to transition away from unabated fossil fuels. Across the board, America's climate leadership has encouraged American companies to invest in private capital for clean energy development and to low to middle income nations, and so much more. I thank the business leaders who are here today for leading the way, and I mean that. All this historic climate change is in stark contrast to my predecessor. He says he'd repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. He'd let our factories shut down. He'd move the world backwards. His denial of climate change condemns our future generations to a more dangerous world. And by the way, windmills do not cause cancer. I think we've laid out a better choice, and today we're better positioned than any other nation of the world to promote a clean energy future. In fact, it's a perfect time to go big. The market for clean energy is booming. Inflation is way down in America. The Federal Reserve just announced lowering interest rates, and I predict they'll go further down. We should give business even more confidence to invest trillions of dollars that are on the sidelines in the clean energy industries of the future. I'm doing my part. Now I'm calling on other companies with the capital in the room to invest more and do more. Now's the time. Let me close with this. 4 years, we've gone from historic crisis to historic progress. And in doing it, with a new playbook based on one of the oldest truths of our nation. Invest in America. Believe in America. Believe in possibilities. And share it with the world. That's what I see, if I could see all of you, when I look at all of you. I really mean this. I know I only look like I'm 40 years old, but I'm a little older. You know, I've been doing this a long time, 51 years in elective office. And it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But I give my words to Biden. I'm never more optimistic about America's future. And Michael, let me go back to you. Your initiatives, your commitment, your vision, your dedication have literally changed the world and gone a long way to encourage Americans to be convinced once again that we can do anything. We just remember who the hell we are. We're the United States of America. There is nothing beyond our capacity when we act together. Folks, as a student of history, we're the only nation in the world that's come out of every major crisis we've entered stronger than we went in. Every single time. Every single time. And with this assembly in this room, you're the leaders not only in America, you're the world. The rest of the world looks to us. And it's not about my being president. I give you my word. Think about it. If we didn't lead, who the hell leads? Who fills the vacuum without America leading? That's who we are. That's our obligation. And that's our incredible opportunity. So, folks, I really am optimistic. I really mean it. You listened, and I didn't even go into all the things that are going on in the rest of the world in terms of how they want to transition away from fossil fuels, want to use peaceful nuclear technology, a whole range of things. Hydrogen, so many things are on the table. And we can do this. We really can. And we owe it to our children. And quite frankly, we owe it to lead the world. If my mom was here, she'd say, Joey, end it, okay? And I will. So God bless you all. May God protect our troops. Thank you very, very much.
Played out by Hail to the Chief, President Joe Biden in New York speaking live at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum. A bit of a progress report on the administration's efforts to fight climate change as billed by the White House. He described the administration's approach as a new formula on climate. Let's listen to the president back at the mic.
No, Joey, spread it. Let's spread the faith. Thank you.
We'll call that the last word from the president as he makes his way off the stage. Having spoken to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, speaking to the benefits that he described as lowering energy costs for families, helping to lower costs of installing rooftop solar energy efficient appliances. Also, as we've heard before, creating, in his words, more than 330,000 clean energy jobs. This is not the first time we heard from the president today. This event taking place against the backdrop of UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly, underway this week in New York. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Kaylee Lyons here on Balance of Power, the Tuesday edition, as we bring you those remarks live. Climate in the air today, Kaylee, from Washington to New York to Washington State.
Yeah, not the district, but the actual state of. As Biden speaks about climate on the global and national level, let's talk about it on the state level as well, because in 2021, Washington state put into place a law called the Washington Climate Commitment Act, which provided for a cap and invest program designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 95% by 2050. But on the ballot this November is an initiative aimed at repealing that law and prohibiting any state agencies from implementing a cap and trade or cap and tax program. For more, we're joined now by someone who is also on the ballot in Washington's election, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Bob Ferguson, who is currently the state's attorney general. Sir, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much for your patience. We do want to get in to the gubernatorial race more broadly, but just specifically on these questions around the carbon market and potential that this law is repealed. Those that seem to be in favor of an appeal, by and large, their biggest criticism is that the money is not being spent well. How can the state convince those skeptical people that they will be better stewards of the money raised in carbon auctions?
You bet. First, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And yes, so far in Washington state, we've actually received close to a couple $2 billion. And those dollars are being invested all across our state in what you just heard from President Biden, clean energy projects, clean energy jobs. I spent some time in the eastern part of our state a few weeks ago in East Wenatchee, and I went to an apprenticeship training program. What were those hundreds of workers being trained for? New jobs in a clean energy economy. So the Climate Commitment Act here that's going to be on the ballot, as you said, in November, it's not just good for our climate, it's also good for jobs. And that's why, with some tweaks, I think I'm going to be supporting it.
Mr. Attorney General, it's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg. I want to ask you about another ballot measure. It has to do with capital gains that would repeal, in this case, the state's new capital gains tax and repeal the law that Kaylee mentioned, creating the state's carbon market. With regard to capital gains, this is important to our viewers and listeners, and it strikes me very familiar to the national debate that's being had right now on the presidential campaign trail. You've taken a stand on this. Is that ballot measure going to pass?
Well, look, I've got my own campaign to worry about, but my sense from what I've read in the newspapers and the polling that I've seen, it seems like it might be close. But I think at the end of the day, the voters of Washington state will reject the repeal of the capital gains tax because they're going to see and understand that hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that are generated from that capital gains tax are being invested in early learning, in childcare, in school construction all across our state, which is a big need in communities all across our state. So I think they'll see that those investments are going to pay off for our kids and our school system. And I think that's why this effort to repeal the capital gains tax will ultimately be defeated.
Well, sir, we do understand you are focused on your own race, and we actually spoke with the man you are running against in that race. Dave Reichert, Washington State Republican gubernatorial candidate, was on this program back in March. This is just a taste of what he told us.
I think it really creates an opportunity here in the state for us to begin a dialogue with the other party. And I think people here in Washington state actually want a balanced government this time around. They want to see that dialogue created. They want to see a conversation between ideas and differing ideas to solve the problems that we're facing today.
So, sir, if we focus on that notion of differing ideas, you have been running, in part, casting yourself as a change agent. But given your relationship, closeness to the outgoing Governor Jay Inslee, the fact that you are a Democrat, what actually would you carry forward differently than what is currently happening in the state? What issues specifically?
Sure. Well, first of all, Dave Reichert's ideas are totally out of the mainstream from the majority of Washington state voters. He went back to Congress and voted 3 times for a nationwide abortion ban that criminalizes doctors. He went back to Congress and voted dozens of times to repeal and get the Affordable Care Act, which would have huge implications for hundreds of thousands of Washingtonians. And he even says, I love Donald Trump's policies. Look, he's just wildly out of touch. Hey, I believe I'm a change agent because guess what? In my time in politics, that's always been my approach. When I first ran for office, I took on a 20-year incumbent Democrat like myself and won that race. As an attorney general, I've transformed our office to better serve the people, creating a civil rights team, growing our consumer protection team. Right now, we're challenging a huge grocery store merger that would have huge impacts on consumers and workers here in Washington state. We've transformed our office to better serve the people of Washington state, and I think that's what they want in their next governor, not somebody who's focused on nationwide abortion bans or stripping away health care protections. I think they want someone who's focused on them, and that's been my time in politics, and I think that's why Dave Reichert's been struggling in the primary and struggling in the polls.
Well, you stood up to Donald Trump as well as Attorney General. It's not lost on us you were among the first, if not the first, to sue over what he refers to now as his famous Muslim ban. I wonder your thoughts on a Trump 2.0, and if you were governor of your state, how you would handle issues like that. You're going to have to work with the president as well, aren't you?
Well, first, you're right that we were the first office of Attorney General anywhere in the country to challenge Donald Trump on that first infamous and immoral and unconstitutional Muslim travel ban, and we won that case. And we went on to defeat Donald Trump over 50 times in court. So I do have some experience dealing with him. What I would say is, obviously, God forbid if Donald Trump is our president again, but if that dark day were to come, I feel I'm as qualified as anyone running for a statewide office across the country to know how to deal with the Trump administration, know how to stand up to that Trump administration, and defend and protect the rights and our environment here in Washington state.
Well, as we consider the potential future president you'd be dealing with, the other option, of course, is Kamala Harris, who was Attorney General of California while you were serving as Attorney General in Washington. So presumably you two have worked together in the past. You've obviously endorsed her for president. Where do you see the greatest potential partnerships for the state of Washington and the federal government if she indeed wins this election?
Oh, I think the possibilities are limitless if Kamala Harris is elected president. I'll just say, you're right, my first 2 years as Attorney General as a new AG were her last 2 years as AG in California. And what I saw in then Attorney General Kamala Harris was a fighter for the people of California, someone who was smart, someone who worked hard, and someone who really centered the people she represented every day that I worked with her. And so that's why I admire her so much, super excited about her presidency and what she'll be doing for working people on addressing the challenges we have with our economy, with affordability. We're aligned on that and look forward to a partnership with her when she's elected president.
He's the Democratic candidate for governor of Washington, Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Thank you, sir, for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, the UN General Assembly underway in New York City right now as tensions continue to escalate in the Middle East. James Jeffrey, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, will be with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think it's slowly and steadily escalating into something like a war. The question will be ultimately, does it turn into a ground war? But when you line up all the things that have happened in recent weeks, and now more aggressive bombing across Lebanon in order to take out the very rockets and missiles that Hezbollah likes to aim at Israel, I think this is all gearing up for something much more substantial than we're seeing now.
Michael Allen, Managing Director, Partner, Beacon Global Strategies, talking with us earlier on the early edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio, saying whether or not he believes the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah can in fact be considered a full-scale war following the escalation that we have seen over the past days. Joining us with more right now, James Jeffrey, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, chair of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. There does seem to be a feeling right now that the genie is out of the bottle. Do you agree with Michael Allen that there's still a diplomatic solution potentially to turn this back?
First, thanks for having me on. Second, our sympathy and condolences go out to the many innocent Lebanese and Israelis who, of course, suffer from this escalation. But let's be clear, it isn't a question of avoiding a war or not. We've been in an acute war since the 7th of October, 2023, between Israel, supported by the United States and at times other countries, and an Iranian-led alliance. What we have now between Hezbollah and Israel is one campaign in this conflict, just like Gaza is another. The Houthi Red Sea operation is a third. So we have to look at it from that perspective. That means that it's not just important to stop the shooting, although that is usually what we want to do. It's also important that Israel and its friends and the United States emerge stronger and Iran and its proxies emerge weaker. They're going to do this again. We understand this with Putin in Ukraine after a decade more of him marching step by step. We still don't seem to quite get it with Iran and its proxies.
Well, so, sir, as you described this as an acute war already underway and this just being a campaign within it, what will bring it to its end? It sounds like what you're saying is that if it has to be Iran and its proxies being essentially totally backing off, is that an end that has to be achieved militarily, or is there a role for diplomacy here, specifically when it comes to a ceasefire in Gaza that Hezbollah says will make them stop firing rockets into Israel?
Well, a ceasefire in Gaza is desirable, but the administration has stressed in the last few weeks that the main problem at the moment is Hamas. And of course, Hamas wants to see a larger war between Israel and Hezbollah. But the point is, I'm sorry, Hezbollah's position that it can fire thousands of rockets into Israel to support another group in Gaza that is conducting or has started conducting a terrorist campaign against Israel is not sufficient justification for me to shrug this off and say, gee, Israel, why don't you just stop killing people in Gaza and Hezbollah will stop trying to kill Israelis. This is a longer-term problem that has been on the our desks for the last 20 years in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, Lebanon, and has now grown acute in the last year. What we need is Hezbollah to stop shooting and pull back. If it doesn't do so, Israel, under international law, has the right, and under the current situation, probably the necessity to escalate.
So as you make note, Ambassador, this issue has occupied a good chunk of your career in foreign policy. With your experience, then, what would be your advice to the administration on where to draw the line on U.S. military involvement? And I'm not running straight to boots on the ground, but if there is, in fact, a concerted attack against Israel that involves ballistic missiles, for instance, it's going to be U.S. airmen and sailors who have to help repel that attack, right? Where should we draw the line?
Well, first of all, we will. I think President Biden has made that clear. Secretary of Defense Austin has moved more assets into the area. You'll remember back in April, we were critical in deterring and defending against a major hundreds and hundreds of Iranian and other missiles and rockets. We'll do that again.
Yes.
At the same time, the administration will be trying to broker a ceasefire and a Hezbollah pullback. But the point is, Hezbollah has to stop firing rockets into Israel. They have basically depopulated about 20 or 30 kilometers of Israeli territory south of the Lebanese border. Israel is a small country. It can't afford to give up bits and pieces of its country permanently.
Ambassador, as you allude to members of the administration here, including the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, I would point out that today, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCaul, moved to find the secretary in contempt of Congress for not showing up to testify in a hearing today about the Afghanistan withdrawal. This is what Chairman McCaul had to say, and we'll have you respond.
Because Secretary Blinken has chosen not to appear and to willfully defy the subpoena under Article 1 of the Constitution, I hereby adjourn this hearing and intend to proceed with a markup to begin the formal process of holding the Secretary in contempt of Congress.
It is worth pointing out, Mr. Ambassador, that Secretary of State Blinken is currently at the United Nations General Assembly, and in his letter to McCall said the events of this week were scheduled months ago, have been publicly noticed. He went on to say, I believe you would agree U.S. representation at the highest levels in these engagements is essential, reiterating an offer to send a deputy secretary to the hearing instead, and says he will make himself available to testify after he returns from travel. Sir, is it helpful to hold a cabinet secretary like this, especially with the kinds of conflicts that are currently happening in the world, in contempt of Congress for being at a body that could endeavor to help come to a resolution in some of these conflicts?
Certainly, it's not helpful to demand that Blinken be in Washington today. It's not, I have to be careful here, it's not unreasonable to expect Blinken to appear before that committee, which has responsibility over the actions of Blinken's Department of State, to explain the extraordinary developments in Kabul in the summer of 2021 that led to the loss of 13 American servicemen and the tragic loss of hundreds of Afghans and, of course, thousands of people we're trying to get out who didn't get out. This is a disaster, and the Department of State, by its own internal inspector general and other reports, bears responsibility. Tony Blinken has yet to give a full disclosure of what he did or what he didn't do in those days and weeks in 2021. That's reasonable. Now, there's also politics here. There's an election. We all know that. But once again, this is a major foreign policy disaster, and I think that's generally understood in the United States and elsewhere. It's not unreasonable to expect sooner or later, at a time convenient to him, that Blinken appear and talk.
All right, James Jeffrey, chair of the Wilson Center's Middle East program and former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, thank you for your time this evening, sir. Coming up, Vice President Harris and former President Trump focus on their economic agendas this week, with Trump delivering a speech in Savannah, Georgia today, focused on manufacturing. Harris is on deck in Pittsburgh tomorrow. We'll have more with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
To exploit these pro-manufacturing policies, their full potential is going to happen. It's going to happen very quickly. I will appoint a manufacturing ambassador whose sole task, and it'll be a great one, will be to go around the world and convince major manufacturers to pack up and move back to America where they want to be.
Donald Trump earlier today floating the idea of a manufacturing ambassador in addition to federal zones for companies to produce and, of course, a lower corporate tax rate for companies that make their goods in America. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our political panel, Lisa Camusa Miller, former RNC communications director and Republican strategist, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. Of course, it was Donald Trump in Georgia. Today it will be Harris in Pittsburgh tomorrow, both of them taking a great deal of time this week to focus specifically on their economic policies and zeroing in on manufacturing. Kristen, this is a place at the Rust Belt by and large, right? And I guess manufacturing workers in Georgia as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think they all know that they need to speak to these workers. I think Trump is a little hard to decipher what he's actually planning to do and what his economic plans are. I think you'll see Kamala talk about not just manufacturing jobs, but also you've got developments in AI that are changing the way things are working, and then also small businesses. She's been talking a lot about incentives for small business owners.
I'm just curious how many people are reading and listening, and by that I mean voters. When it comes down to contrasting these plans, we're hungry for details. We keep asking both of these candidates to fill in the blanks. But who's the audience for these speeches this week, whether it's Trump or Kamala Harris?
Well, I think in large part they're talking to their own base, and then they're trying to find nuggets and sound bites that are ideal for the folks in the middle, the swing states that,
as opposed to the street, for instance, or investors who are listening for economic details?
There is so little daylight between their two plans, at least at this point, in terms of details that we've seen, that both of them have a lot more to offer. And yes, I think that the street is paying very close attention, but whether or not we have clear indications of what that means is worrisome. if only for the fact that Donald Trump continues to mention names of actual companies that I think is actually concerning, and that alone is a signal to Wall Street to be concerned.
Alluding to Deere, for example, and a 200% tariff if they make goods in Mexico. We also have heard from Donald Trump this week and yesterday, specifically in Pennsylvania, talking about early voting. And if the question is on clarity here, have a listen to this one.
Early voting begins in Pennsylvania over the next 2 weeks, and we need each and every one of you to go out. Just don't take anything for granted. We have to win Pennsylvania. Go out and make a plan to vote early, vote absentee, or vote in person on Election Day. Now we have this stupid stuff where you can vote 45 days early. I wonder what the hell happens during that 45. Let's move see these votes. We've got about 1 million votes in there. Let's move them.
So I'm not sure what exactly the message is here, Lisa, but if you were still at the RNC and you're listening to him call early voting stupid after just encouraging people to do that, what signal is that sending for those who might be thinking about casting a ballot for Donald Trump?
Well, I think if nothing else, he was given a script to read from, and then he editorialized right afterwards. That's how I saw all of that play out. I know that having worked on campaigns most of my adult life, we want people to get out there and vote. We want early voting. We want people to have early access, have access to the ballots and access to their constitutional right to vote. And that is a message that we all know is one that he's been perpetuating about the fact that whether or not votes are actually counted properly. And that's one that's inconsistent with what is the truth.
Well, it certainly could be confusing, and it's something I actually asked Michael Whatley about, who is chair of the RNC. He did not agree that it was stupid. It's part of a very powerful strategy that both sides can employ. I asked Whatley as well about what's going on in North Carolina, remembering that he ran the Republican Party in that state. And what's going on right now with gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson, the Republican who has been accused of posting some pretty offensive stuff on porn sites. Most all of his senior staff has quit the campaign. And here's the reaction from Chair Whatley.
Those comments are absolutely antithetical to Republican values. And if Mark Robinson's going to continue in this race, then, yeah, I do think that he is going to have to demonstrate to the voters of North Carolina that those are not his words, his actions, or his values.
Those are the most complete remarks that we have heard from the chair of the RNC on this. And so, advantage Democrats?
I mean, I think advantage Democrats. I mean, I think that you've got a severely flawed candidate who's been saying a lot of stuff that's not appealing to mainstream women or voters at large in North Carolina. But I think any step up you can have in that state, and you've seen the Harris-Walz campaign spending a lot of time there for good reason. So, yes, I think it's helpful. You know, I never wish that on any of those campaign staff that all had to leave and are probably looking for other jobs right now. But, yes, net positive for us.
Well, as we consider the kind of positive areas in which the campaign is trying to cling to, not only drawing contrasts between candidates on perhaps moral questions, but issues as well, specifically on abortion, is something that obviously Vice President Harris has been talking a lot about. And today, she told Wisconsin Public Radio that she thinks they should eliminate the filibuster in the Senate for Roe, essentially to codify abortion rights. We've already seen Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema responding to this, essentially saying, bad idea. Was it one, Kristen?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's a necessary part of her politics running for president of the United States. It's a huge part of her platform and who she is. This is always something that's going to be debated on either side. And
but
people,
if you get rid of the filibuster, couldn't it be used the other way to take away?
And that is what that's the fear. That is what Senator Sinema has said many times over. That it does. It goes both ways, right? And the Democrats aren't going to be in control of everything all the time, and particularly in the Senate. So you do have to be careful with that. But I think that she said the right thing.
Well, Mitch McConnell must be licking his chops right now. Is this grist for Republicans, the idea of getting rid of the filibuster? Or does this kind of go over the heads of voters? Who cares?
Goes over the heads of voters. But if you're in Washington, D.C., when the map is advantage Republicans, I think that Republicans are probably thinking that this wouldn't be such a bad idea.
Really?
On a single issue
or
across the board?
On this single issue in particular.
So
I think
it's off
that
the table and they're not asked about it for the...
No, everything's on the table.
Careers.
Everything is on the
Well,
table.
what would be the motivation, though, just quickly?
I just think that maybe that for them, they see this as an opportunity for Democrats to make a call in the Senate that they won't necessarily have control over once the Republicans have the majority.
So set the precedent, essentially.
How about that?
All
Goes
right.
both ways.
Indeed. Lisa Camusa-Miller and Kristen Hahn, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we're going to have plenty more to talk about tomorrow. As we mentioned, after the economic speech Donald Trump delivered in Georgia today, Joe, tomorrow we will get the speech from Kamala Harris in Pittsburgh, also supposed to be about manufacturing.
And we'll continue delving into these details for you, as you would expect, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you for joining us, as always, on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.